Jasmine stood in the small, fluorescent-lit office, her palms sweating as she fumbled with the papers in front of her. The soft hum of the printer and the sharp click of keyboards filled the tense silence. She had worked hard to get here, fighting for every opportunity in a company where everyone seemed to look through her, where every gesture and every word felt like it was meant to remind her she didn't belong. But nothing had prepared her for this. Richard Taylor, her boss, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a sneer playing on his lips. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in an expensive suit that screamed privilege. Jasmine didn't trust him. She had heard the rumors, the jokes whispered behind closed doors, the way he made others feel small when he thought they weren't looking. Today it was her turn. "You think you're going to get ahead here, Jasmine?" Richard's voice was sharp, cold. "You're not one of them. You'll never be one of them." Her heart sank, but she held his gaze, refusing to let him see the tears welling up in her eyes. She had heard it before. The dismissive comments, the sideways glances, the microaggressions that stung just a little too much, but this felt different. This felt like a line had been crossed. The door clicked open, and the HR representative, a silent bystander to the scene, glanced at Jasmine, then quickly averted her gaze. She didn't even speak. Jasmine's blood ran cold, but she stayed quiet. She wasn't ready to confront him, not like this, not yet. The door shut behind Richard as he left the room, his laughter echoing in the hallway, and Jasmine knew this wouldn't be the last time. She had no idea what would happen next, but she couldn't stay silent anymore. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the phone. The truth had to come out. It had to. Jasmine could hear the sounds of the office around her, but it was as if they were fading into the background. The printer whirred, and the hum of the air conditioning was almost soothing, but there was something about the weight of Richard's presence that made the air feel thick and suffocating. She could feel his eyes on her, his usual predatory gaze that always made her skin crawl. She straightened her posture, trying to ignore the feeling in the pit of her stomach. There had been whispers about Richard, about how he had a way of making people feel small, of cutting them down with a sharp comment or an offhand remark. Jasmine had heard them all, and she had learned to smile and nod, to keep her head down and push through. But today felt different. "You think you're going to get ahead here, Jasmine?" Richard's voice sliced through the room, his tone low but clear. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. Jasmine froze, the papers in her hand suddenly feeling heavier than they should. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "I'm just doing my job," she said, keeping her voice even, though she could feel the heat of anger creeping up her neck. Richard chuckled, the sound cold and dismissive. "You know what they say about people like you." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, a challenge, a taunt. "You'll never be one of them." The blood drained from Jasmine's face as the words struck her like a slap. She had heard the whispers, the coded language, the jokes that never seemed to go away, but hearing him say it like that was different. This was no longer a whisper in the hallways. This was an attack. Jasmine opened her mouth to respond, but the words got stuck in her throat. She wasn't prepared for this, for the ugly truth of what was happening. She had fought so hard to make a place for herself in this company, but it felt like it was all unraveling in an instant. As Richard turned to leave, he gave her one last look. His smile was thin, mocking. "Don't think you're special just because you're still here. You're a token, nothing more." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Jasmine in the cold silence of the office. Her heart pounded in her chest, the room feeling smaller with each breath. She couldn't just let this go. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling. "I'm not staying quiet anymore. This ends now." Jasmine sat at her desk, her fingers drumming on the cold surface of the wooden table, her eyes fixed on the blinking cursor on her screen. The day after Richard's insult, the weight of his words lingered like a shadow over her. She hadn't told anyone yet, hadn't had the chance or perhaps the courage. The whole situation felt too surreal, like something she shouldn't have to deal with in 2026, but here she was, forced to confront it. She glanced around the office, her colleagues typing away in their cubicles, the ambient sound of the workplace a distant murmur in her ears. Everyone seemed to move in slow motion, too caught up in their own world to notice her storming emotions. The silence felt suffocating. It was lunchtime. She stepped out into the break room, where the buzz of conversation filled the air. People were gathered around the coffee machine, exchanging small talk. "Hey, Jasmine," said Matt, one of the few people she occasionally exchanged pleasantries with. His voice upbeat as always. He grabbed a cup of coffee and smiled. "How's it going?" "Good," she replied, forcing a smile, though her mind was racing. "How's the new project coming along? You know, the one with Richard." The mention of Richard's name made her stomach churn, but she kept her composure. "It's fine. Just the usual." She tried to sound casual. "You sure? You've been quiet lately." Matt seemed to sense something off but quickly added, "Don't worry, you'll catch up." Jasmine swallowed, nodding, trying to keep the conversation light. But as she sipped her coffee, she couldn't help but notice the way her colleagues interacted with her. They all smiled politely, exchanging pleasantries, but there was an unmistakable barrier, a sense of distance. It was as if they saw her but not really. As if they had already made up their minds about her long before she walked in the door each day. That afternoon, Jasmine decided to take the first step. She talked to Alicia. Alicia had been in the office for years, longer than most of the staff. She was smart, ambitious, and outspoken, the kind of woman who never seemed to shy away from standing her ground. Jasmine had always admired her from afar, especially when Alicia had boldly confronted Richard in the past about his disorganization and lack of leadership. But this time was different. Jasmine had to tell someone. She found Alicia in the break room, alone, staring at her phone. "Hey, can we talk for a minute?" Jasmine's voice was soft, almost hesitant, but Alicia immediately looked up, her expression turning serious. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Jasmine sat across from her, swallowing her nerves. "Yesterday Richard said something to me, something that—" She paused, struggling to find the words. "Something that felt wrong. It wasn't just a comment. It was personal. He said I'd never be one of them. That I'm just a token here." Alicia's eyebrows furrowed, her gaze darkening. "He said that to you?" Jasmine nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The weight of the moment felt heavy, like a curtain had fallen, pulling her into a space of vulnerability she wasn't ready for. "Jasmine, that's not okay," Alicia said, her voice firm but quiet. "You know that, right?" "I don't know what to do," Jasmine admitted, the words spilling out. "I mean, I can't just let it slide. But if I say something, what if no one believes me? Or worse, what if it ruins my career?" Alicia leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Jasmine's. "Look, I've seen how Richard behaves. He's a bully, and he's been like this for years. People talk about it, but no one ever does anything." She sighed, her expression turning thoughtful. "But if you don't speak up, who will? This isn't just about you, Jasmine. It's about all of us." Jasmine's heart clenched. "But I'm not sure if I can handle the consequences. I need my job." "I get it. I do." Alicia's voice softened. "But you're not alone in this. You don't have to face him by yourself. If you want to report him, I'll back you up. But you have to make the choice." Jasmine looked at her for a long moment, weighing her words. The silence stretched between them before she nodded slowly. I think I need to do something. I can't just keep letting this slide." Alicia gave her an encouraging smile, but there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. "We'll do this together." The next day, Jasmine found herself sitting in the HR office, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was sterile, too white, too clean, making her feel smaller than she already did. She could hear the faint sound of typing coming from the HR assistant's desk, the mechanical clicks of the keys creating an uncomfortable rhythm. The HR representative, Mrs. Thomas, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and glasses, looked up from her screen. "How can I help you today, Jasmine?" she asked, her tone polite, professional, but distant. "I need to report something," Jasmine began, her voice trembling slightly, but she steadied herself. Richard Taylor made some inappropriate comments to me yesterday. It wasn't just casual. It felt personal. Mrs. Thomas raised an eyebrow. What exactly did he say? He told me I'd never be one of them. That I'm just a token here. Jasmine held her breath as she waited for a response. Mrs. Thomas didn't seem surprised. She paused for a moment, looking at her computer screen before turning her gaze back to Jasmine. Jasmine, I understand that what you're saying is troubling. But you have to understand we can't act on just one isolated comment. This might not be something we can pursue unless there's a pattern of behavior. Jasmine's stomach twisted as the words hit her. Pattern. That was the problem. No one ever saw the pattern, not until it was too late. I'm not making this up. Jasmine's voice rose, the frustration she had been suppressing for months leaking through. I'm telling you what happened. This is real. Mrs. Thomas didn't flinch, but there was a tightness in her jaw. I'm not dismissing you, Jasmine. But we have to be careful. The company is very sensitive to accusations of discrimination. It can't just be a one-time thing. You need more evidence if you want to take this further. Jasmine felt the weight of her words fall to the floor between them. The door of the office felt even heavier, a reminder that no matter how much she pushed, the door might slam shut in her face. Thank you for your time, Jasmine said, rising from her seat. There was nothing more to say. It felt as if the system itself was designed to protect Richard, to dismiss her. Just another small, insignificant voice in the machine. The days that followed felt like an endless loop for Jasmine. The hum of the office, the faces she passed in the hallway, the steady rhythm of her keyboard, all felt like background noise to the reality she was now trapped in. Richard's words had lingered, festering in the corners of her mind, and now every interaction with him, every meeting, felt charged. His condescension, his dismissive glances, it was all too familiar, yet somehow sharper now. The microaggressions were no longer subtle. They were deliberate. Jasmine sat in the conference room, her back straight, eyes focused on the screen in front of her. She had been assigned to present a report for an upcoming client meeting, a task she had prepared for tirelessly. Her hands were steady, but her mind raced as she waited for Richard to speak. Jasmine! Richard's voice cut through the room like a knife. You sure you got this? You don't look like you've had enough time to understand the numbers. Jasmine's chest tightened. The comment was a jab, not just at her work but at her intelligence. His eyes scanned her face, waiting for a reaction, but she bit back the sharp retort threatening to spill out. Instead, she nodded, maintaining composure. I've got it, Richard. The numbers are all in order. Richard raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't believe her, and it was written all over his face. Well, we'll see, won't we? His voice dripped with sarcasm, the room growing tense as everyone fell silent. Jasmine glanced at her colleagues, hoping one of them might speak up, but no one did. Alicia was absent from this meeting, and without her, Jasmine felt even more exposed, vulnerable to Richard's power. The presentation dragged on, but Jasmine's focus wavered. She couldn't ignore the subtle comments. It was the way Richard always questioned her, the way he never seemed satisfied with her work, no matter how well she performed. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he made her feel small, insignificant. By the time lunch came around, Jasmine was drained. She grabbed her lunch and sat by the window in the break room, her thoughts swirling. She barely noticed Matt joining her until he sat down across from her, looking a little unsure. Everything okay? He asked, his voice soft, his eyes studying her face. Jasmine offered a half smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Yeah, fine. Just the usual. Matt's brows furrowed. You don't seem fine. What's going on? She hesitated, unsure whether to speak up. Was it worth it? Would anyone care? Richard's voice echoed in her head. You'll never be one of them. Jasmine swallowed her frustration, shaking her head. I don't know. It's just, everything's a little off lately. It feels like no matter how much I do, it's never enough. Matt frowned but didn't press her further. Instead, he offered a sympathetic glance. I get it. I've seen the way Richard treats you. It's not right. Jasmine looked up at him, startled. What do you mean? You don't notice it, but he's always on you, Matt said, his voice quiet. Always questioning you, always making you feel like you're not good enough. But it's more than that, isn't it? Jasmine stared at him, her heart beating faster. Matt wasn't one to talk about office politics, and she couldn't remember a time when he'd mentioned Richard in any way other than the occasional remark about how difficult the boss could be. But today was different. What are you saying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the break room as if making sure no one was listening. Look, I'm not going to pretend that I know what it's like for you, but I've heard the jokes. The comments people make when you're not around. I don't like it, Jasmine. Wrong. But nobody says anything. They just let it happen. Jasmine's chest tightened as she listened, a mixture of anger and relief flooding her at once. It wasn't just her. Others had seen it too. The weight of knowing that someone else had noticed the behavior, that someone else understood the subtle cruelty, felt like a small but significant victory. But what do I do about it? Jasmine's voice cracked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. How do I keep going when everything I do is questioned, and no one will stand up for me? Matt leaned forward, his expression serious. I don't know, Jasmine. I'm not saying it's easy, but you don't have to face it alone. You need to make sure someone else sees it too. Someone who can speak up when you can't. Jasmine nodded, her fingers tightening around her lunch container. It wasn't a solution, but it was something. The idea that maybe, just maybe, there was someone else out there who cared, someone who might back her up, was enough to fuel her next step. The days that followed felt like a constant game of watching her back. Jasmine had become hyper-aware of Richard's every move, his every word. And with each encounter, the weight of his microaggressions became harder to ignore. During a meeting about a new marketing initiative, Richard interrupted Jasmine yet again. Jasmine, maybe you should leave the strategy discussions to someone with a bit more experience, Richard said, his tone condescending, his eyes scanning the room for approval. Jasmine's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm, to respond with poise. I'm confident in the strategies I've suggested, Richard. They align with the goals we've discussed. Richard smirked, a mocking glint in his eye. Well, we'll see if they're enough. The words stung more than they should have, but Jasmine refused to let him see how much they hurt. The room was silent except for the sound of papers being shuffled and the faint tapping of someone's phone. No one said a word. No one ever did. Jasmine's hands clenched at her sides as she fought the urge to lash out. Instead, she took a deep breath, the silence suffocating her. She couldn't let him break her. Not like this. Later that evening, she sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly. The weight of the day was pressing down on her chest, and she had to force herself to focus. Alicia's message pinged on her phone. Alicia. Hey, just wanted to check in. I know things have been rough. Have you thought about talking to HR again? Jasmine stared at the message, the flashing cursor on her screen. She had tried that already. They didn't listen. They never listened. But maybe things were different now. Maybe with Matt's encouragement, maybe with a plan, she could find a way to make it stop. She closed her eyes, taking in a deep breath. Can't keep letting this slide. The next morning, Jasmine couldn't shake the weight of the decision she had made the night before. As she sat at her desk, sorting through the usual emails and preparing for another round of meaningless meetings, her thoughts were consumed with one thing: the HR office. She had made the call. It wasn't something she had done lightly. Even after hearing Matt's words of encouragement and Alicia's silent support, the fear of retaliation still loomed large. She couldn't help but feel like an outsider in a system that was built to protect people like Richard, not people like her. But she had to try. She owed it to herself to at least speak up. At 10 a.m., just as the office was starting to buzz with activity, she stood up and walked toward the HR department. Her palms were damp, and her breath felt shallow, but she kept her head high. She couldn't let her fear win. Not today. As she reached the door to Mrs. Thomas's office, her heart began to pound harder. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see the HR representative seated at her desk, typing away on her computer. Jasmine hesitated for a moment before knocking softly. "Come in," Mrs. Thomas called, not looking up from her screen. Jasmine pushed the door open and stepped inside, feeling small in the sterile beige room. The air conditioning hummed overhead, making the silence feel even more oppressive. "Good morning, Jasmine," Mrs. Thomas said, finally looking up, her tone polite but distant. "What can I do for you today?" Jasmine swallowed hard, her voice faltering slightly as she spoke. "I need to follow up on a report I made earlier this week. About Richard Taylor." She paused, watching Mrs. Thomas closely, hoping for some sign that her concerns would be taken seriously. Mrs. Thomas raised an eyebrow, her eyes momentarily scanning her computer screen before locking back onto Jasmine. "Ah yes, Richard. I remember you mentioned a comment he made. But I want to remind you that these things can be very delicate, Jasmine. You're sure you want to go through with this?" Jasmine took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Yes, I'm sure. What he said was inappropriate, and it's not the first time he's made comments like that. I can't just let it slide anymore." Mrs. Thomas didn't respond immediately. She turned back to her computer and began typing something, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Jasmine could feel the minutes stretching out in silence. The longer it went on, the more anxious she became. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either change or fall apart. "Jasmine, I understand your frustration," Mrs. Thomas said finally, her voice betraying nothing. "But I need to be clear with you. Comment like the one you're describing is troubling, yes. But we need more than just one isolated incident to take action. The company has a process for these things. We can't just make a decision without all the facts." Jasmine's chest tightened, and she fought the urge to speak over her. "I've been dealing with more than just one comment," Jasmine said, her voice steady now, though the words came out more forcefully than she intended. "Richard makes comments like this all the time. He undermines me in meetings. He questions my abilities, questions me in front of everyone, and it's always wrapped in this thin veil of concern or humor. But it's not funny." Mrs. Thomas looked at her for a moment, then sighed. "I see. And what exactly do you want us to do about this, Jasmine? I can't promise that an investigation will result in any immediate action. It's possible we could reach a resolution, but it's also possible nothing will change." Jasmine felt her blood run cold. Nothing will change. She had heard the stories before. The employees who had come forward with complaints, only to be silenced, ignored, or even punished. The system was designed to protect people like Richard. The power was on his side. Jasmine had seen it in the way the company moved, always quick to defend its own, slow to respond to the concerns of the few. But she wasn't ready to back down. Not now. Not after everything she had endured. "I'm not asking for something immediate," Jasmine said, her voice more resolute now. "I just want this to be taken seriously. I don't want to keep feeling like I'm not valued here, like my voice doesn't matter." Mrs. Thomas studied her for a long moment, and for a second, Jasmine thought she saw a flicker of something in the older woman's eyes. Perhaps empathy, perhaps something else, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "I'll start an inquiry into this," Mrs. Thomas said finally, but her tone was guarded, as though she were doing it out of obligation, not genuine concern. "But I can't guarantee any outcome. You need to understand that." Jasmine's heart sank, but she nodded. "Thank you. Let's keep this between us for now," Mrs. Thomas added quickly. "We don't want to stir up anything unnecessarily, right?" Jasmine's stomach churned at the suggestion. Keep it between us. That was the very thing she had been trying to escape. The silence, the inaction. She had already seen how things worked behind closed doors. "Understood," Jasmine said, forcing a smile, though it felt like her insides were unraveling. "I'll leave it in your hands." As she turned to leave, the door clicked shut behind her, and Jasmine stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing in deeply. She felt no better than when she had entered. If anything, the weight of the conversation had only solidified what she feared most, that nothing would ever change. Jasmine returned to her desk, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. But the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. Richard's shadow loomed over every task, every conversation, every moment of her day. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, wondering what had happened in HR, what they might have said. The next few days passed in a blur, but one thing stood out: Richard's behavior only worsened. He was more condescending, more belittling, and now it was as if he could sense her weakness. He would make snide comments in meetings, always with a smile, as though he were doing her a favor by letting her speak. And worst of all, no one spoke up. No one said a word. They all just watched. Jasmine had known what the system was, but now it felt as if she were drowning in it. She had spoken up. She had followed the proper channels. And yet nothing had changed. But there was one thing Jasmine knew for certain. She wasn't going to let Richard get away with this. Not this time. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next, filled with the same stifling routines, the same dismissive glances from Richard, the same silence from her colleagues. Jasmine was beginning to feel like a ghost, wandering through the office unnoticed, her presence reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience. She had told herself that she'd make it through, that maybe this was just another obstacle, another battle she had to fight alone. But every day, as Richard's insults became bolder, more frequent, her resolve was weakening. His microaggressions had shifted from the subtle to the outright demeaning. He would interrupt her in meetings, undermine her ideas, or make snide comments about her work ethic in front of the team. His behavior was never overtly hostile, but it was deliberate, calculated. He didn't have to say much. His tone, the look in his eyes, said everything. But it wasn't just Richard. The longer Jasmine stayed at the company, the more she saw it. The system itself was flawed. The culture was built on these subtle, insidious forms of discrimination. Richard wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a much larger problem. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the company that protected him, the people who turned a blind eye, and the way Jasmine felt like she was constantly fighting an uphill battle. That afternoon, her frustration reached its boiling point. She had spent the entire morning preparing a presentation for a potential client, a project that she was incredibly passionate about. She knew the figures inside and out, the strategies, the market analysis. She had put in hours of work. But when it was time to present to the team, Richard dismissed her in front of everyone. "Let me take this one, Jasmine," he said with a smile, his tone patronizing. "You don't need to bother with this. I'll handle it." Jasmine's heart clenched, her breath caught in her throat. The words cut deeper than they should have, but it wasn't just the words. It was the smug look on Richard's face, the way he stood there, towering over her, as though he was doing her a favor. The humiliation was unbearable. She had worked so hard for this moment, and in an instant, he had stolen it from her. "Richard, I prepared this," she said, her voice unsteady but firm. "I think I'm the best person to present." Richard smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was cold, almost amused. "Don't worry, Jasmine. I've got it under control." He turned to the rest of the team, ignoring her completely as he started his own version of the presentation. Jasmine stood there, rooted to the spot, her body rigid with anger. The team watched, the tension in the air palpable, but no one spoke up. No one even looked her way. She was invisible. It wasn't the first time Richard had undermined her, but something inside her snapped. She had tried to play by the rules, to stay professional, to work harder than anyone else. But in that moment, she realized it wasn't enough. It wasn't just about her work ethic. It was about the way the system was rigged against her. She felt small, powerless. But something else was stirring inside her now. A spark of defiance, of determination. Jasmine left the conference room, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She walked down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Her heart was pounding, her thoughts a chaotic mess. She had tried to ignore it, to push it down, but now the anger was overwhelming. She wasn't going to let him get away with this anymore. She wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, tell her that she didn't belong here. This wasn't just about her career. This was about dignity, about respect, about standing up for herself, for all the women and people of color who had been pushed to the margins for too long. When she reached her desk, she pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed out a message to Alicia. Jasmine, I'm done playing by their rules. I can't let Richard keep doing this to me. I'm reporting him again, and this time I'm not backing down. She pressed send, then immediately felt the weight of her words. She had done it. She had made the decision. Now there was no going back. Her phone buzzed almost immediately with Alicia's response. Alicia, I'm with you, Jasmine. I know this is scary, but we're not alone. I'll be there with you every step of the way. Jasmine exhaled sharply, the tension in her chest loosening just slightly. Alicia's support meant the world to her. It wasn't just about having an ally. It was about knowing that someone saw her, that someone believed in her. The next day, Jasmine walked into HR with a new sense of purpose. She was no longer afraid of the consequences, no longer afraid of the whispers or the silence that followed her every step. She had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this continue, not for another day. She sat across from Mrs. Thomas, who raised an eyebrow as she took her seat. Jasmine, I wasn't expecting you so soon, she said, her voice cold, professional. What's this about? I'm here to file a formal complaint, Jasmine said, her voice steady. A real one, not just a conversation. Mrs. Thomas looked at her for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jasmine, I'm not sure you understand how serious this is. I understand perfectly, Jasmine said. I'm not just reporting one comment anymore. This is about everything Richard has done to me since I started here. His behavior is damaging and it's affecting my work, my well-being and my career. This has been going on long enough. Mrs. Thomas's eyes flickered with something. Was it concern? Annoyance? Jasmine couldn't tell. But she could see the wheels turning in Mrs. Thomas's mind. Jasmine had seen enough of these situations to know that HR was rarely on the side of the employee. But this time things were different. This time she had evidence. She had a record of Richard's actions, a log of his comments, and a witness in Alicia. I'm serious, Jasmine added, leaning forward. I won't stop until this is addressed. Mrs. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up a stack of papers and began to shuffle through them. The silence stretched on, suffocating. Jasmine sat still, her jaw clenched, waiting for a response. Finally, Mrs. Thomas spoke. Very well. We'll start an investigation, she said, her tone indifferent. But as I've told you before, I can't promise what will come of it. Jasmine's heart sank. She knew better than to expect a miracle. But this time, she wasn't doing this for a resolution. She was doing this for herself. For the respect she deserved. Thank you, she said, rising from her seat. And don't think this is the end. I'm not backing down. As she left the HR office, a feeling of resolve washed over her. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, Jasmine felt like she was finally on the path to winning it. The days following her decision to file the formal complaint were a blur of tension and anticipation. Jasmine knew things were about to escalate, but she couldn't predict just how far Richard would go to protect himself or how the company would react. She had taken a huge risk by filing the complaint, and though she didn't regret it, the fear of retaliation was always lurking in the back of her mind. But what kept her going was Alicia. Since their conversation in the break room, Alicia had been a steady source of support. She checked in regularly, offering words of encouragement, but most importantly, she had promised to back Jasmine up if things got worse. The company was a well-oiled machine built on an unspoken code of silence, but Alicia's willingness to speak out alongside her was the one thing that made Jasmine feel like she wasn't facing the fight alone. That afternoon, as Jasmine sat at her desk, nervously scrolling through her emails, she saw Alicia approaching from the corner of her eye. Alicia's usual confident stride was replaced by a look of quiet determination. She didn't stop at her own desk. She headed straight for Jasmine's. "Got a minute?" Alicia asked softly, leaning against the cubicle wall. Her expression was serious, her voice carrying a weight that immediately put Jasmine on alert. "Of course," Jasmine replied, her pulse quickening. "What's up?" Alicia looked around before pulling up a chair to sit beside her. "I've been talking to a few people," she said, lowering her voice. "There's been some talk going around and I think it's time we make sure we have everything we need to go all the way with this." Jasmine felt her stomach tighten, her heart racing. She knew Alicia was well connected within the company, but she hadn't expected her to be so involved in the investigation. "What are you saying?" Jasmine asked cautiously. Alicia leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "I'm saying I've been hearing whispers about how Richard is starting to spin things. He's making it seem like you're the problem, that you're just an emotional employee who can't handle the pressure, and that this whole thing is just a misunderstanding. And I'm worried that I'll get blamed for everything." Jasmine finished for her, her voice tight. Alicia nodded, her eyes hard. "Exactly. They're going to turn it around on you if we don't act fast. They'll start painting you as the one who's causing trouble, not Richard. And let's be honest, he's got the backing of the upper management. They're going to protect him." Jasmine's anger flared, but Alicia's calm demeanor kept her grounded. This was exactly what Jasmine had feared. The system wasn't built to protect people like her. It was built to protect people like Richard, the ones in power. "I knew this would happen," Jasmine said, clenching her fists. "But I can't back down. I won't let him do this to me. He can't keep getting away with it." "I'm with you," Alicia replied. "And I'm not the only one. I've been speaking with some of the other employees who've had their own issues with Richard. There's a pattern here, Jasmine. You're not the only one he's targeted. You just need to keep gathering the evidence. The more we have, the stronger our case will be." Jasmine's heart pounded as Alicia's words sank in. She wasn't alone in this. There were others who had been quietly enduring the same treatment, but no one had dared to speak up. "Till now," Alicia continued. "I've already spoken to a couple of people who'll back you up. They're ready to testify about his behavior, what they've seen. But we need to move quickly. The longer you wait, the harder it'll be to get anyone to believe us." Jasmine nodded, determination flaring in her chest. She had known she wasn't the only one who had been hurt by Richard, but hearing it from Alicia, knowing that people were ready to stand with her, made her feel like she wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. "I'll keep gathering evidence," Jasmine said, her voice steady, her resolve hardening. "We'll make sure they can't ignore us. I won't let him win." Alicia smiled, the first real smile Jasmine had seen from her in days. "That's what I like to hear." The following week, Jasmine's life became a strange mix of anxiety and adrenaline. Every encounter with Richard felt like a battle, every conversation with a coworker a delicate negotiation. Richard had already started to turn up the heat. He was more condescending than ever, making subtle threats about her job performance, casting doubt on her abilities in front of anyone who would listen. But this time, Jasmine didn't let it break her. Instead, she started to collect everything: emails, messages, conversations. She recorded every instance, every time he belittled her or undermined her work. With Alicia's help, she built a case. It wasn't just about Richard's blatant comments anymore. It was about the pattern, the way he used his power to control and manipulate everyone around him, and how the company had allowed it to go on for so long. One day, while Jasmine was going through her notes in a quiet corner of the office, Alicia approached her again, her face tight with urgency. "We need to move fast," Alicia said, glancing around nervously. "The higher-ups are starting to ask questions. They're already looking for ways to dismiss your complaint. They've heard Richard's side, and they're siding with him. We need to make sure we have everything ready before they shut this down." Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. This was it. She was so close, But everything could still come crashing down if they didn't act quickly. "I've been talking to a few people," Alicia continued. "There's one former employee who left last year who might be willing to come forward. She had some similar experiences with Richard. If we can get her to testify." Before she could finish, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Jasmine looked up to see Richard walking down the hallway toward them, his gaze cold and calculating as he approached. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. This was not the time to back down. "Not now." "Jasmine," Richard said, his voice smooth but dripping with disdain. "I was just looking for you. I think we need to have a chat about your performance." Jasmine stood up slowly, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "I'm busy, Richard," she said, her tone calm but firm. "We can talk later." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No, Jasmine," he said, taking a step closer. "I think we need to talk now, before this goes any further." Jasmine felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. This wasn't just a casual conversation. This was a warning. He was testing her, trying to assert control. But this time she wasn't afraid. "I've got nothing to say to you," she said, her voice low and unwavering. "And I don't need your approval." Richard's eyes flashed with something. Anger, frustration, perhaps even fear. But he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with the unspoken promise of what he might do next. Jasmine watched him go, her heart racing. But as the tension in her chest began to subside, she realized something important. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of what he might do next. She was ready to fight back. And this time she wasn't alone. The next few days passed in a haze of preparation, tension, and quiet determination. Jasmine spent her time reviewing the evidence, refining her case, and ensuring that every detail was covered. Alicia was more than just an ally. She was her partner in this fight. Together, they had reached out to several former employees who had left the company due to Richard's behavior. Each one had a story, a moment of unfair treatment, a memory of Richard's subtle cruelties. With each piece of testimony they gathered, the case against him became stronger. But despite the mounting evidence, Jasmine knew there was still a dangerous unpredictability about this fight. Richard was powerful, and he wasn't someone who would go down without a fight. His presence in the office had become even more suffocating, his smirks more frequent, his insults sharper. It was as if he knew something was coming, though he hadn't yet figured out exactly how to stop it. And then, one afternoon, the moment arrived. The moment she had both dreaded and anticipated. Jasmine was called into Richard's office. "Jasmine," he said as she entered, his voice smooth and controlled, yet something in it felt menacing. "Have a seat." Jasmine forced herself to walk into the room with her head held high, her heart beating like a drum in her chest. She had prepared for this moment, prepared to stay calm, to hold her ground. But now that she was here, facing him across the sleek, polished desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to walk into a trap. Richard didn't waste any time. As soon as she was seated, he leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. His expression was one of faux concern, but his eyes were cold. "I know you've been making some serious allegations," he began, his voice low but clear. "And I think it's time we had a candid conversation about your behavior." Jasmine felt a tightness in her chest, but she kept her face neutral. "My behavior," she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've only spoken the truth. You've made my work environment impossible to navigate. Your behavior is the issue here, Richard." He chuckled, a cold, hollow sound that made her skin crawl. "Oh, Jasmine," he said, shaking his head. "You're mistaken. You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. You see, the company values professionalism, but I'm starting to think you've been struggling with that." Jasmine's stomach churned, but she didn't back down. "You've harassed me, undermined me, and belittled me at every turn. You've made it impossible for me to succeed here. You're the one who doesn't belong in this office." Richard's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as his smile faded. That's a dangerous accusation, he said, his voice dropping, losing the facade of civility. And I'm sure you're aware of the consequences of making false claims, especially ones that could damage the company's reputation. Jasmine clenched her fists in her lap, the heat of anger rising in her veins. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to intimidate her, trying to make her feel small, trying to get her to back down. But she couldn't. Not anymore. You think I'm scared of you? Jasmine asked, her voice cold. I'm not. And I'm not going to let you get away with it anymore. I've reported you to HR, and I've gathered evidence of everything you've done. I won't let you manipulate me or anyone else in this company. Not anymore. Richard's face went from icy calm to barely controlled fury in the blink of an eye. He stood up suddenly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. For a moment, Jasmine thought he might actually lunge at her, but he stopped himself, his fists clenched by his sides. You're making a big mistake, Jasmine, he hissed. You think anyone is going to believe you? I've been here longer than you've been alive. Have connections, power. You're just a little office assistant trying to stir up trouble. And I will ruin you if you continue with this nonsense. Jasmine's heart raced, but she forced herself to look him in the eye. You're wrong. You're the one who's going to fall, Richard. And when you do, I won't be the only one left standing. For a moment there was nothing but silence, the tension between them so thick that it felt like the air itself was vibrating. Richard's eyes were full of venom. His lips curled into a sneer as he took a step closer to her. Jasmine didn't flinch. Don't get too confident, Richard warned, his voice low and dangerous. I will make sure you regret this. Jasmine stood up, not giving an inch. You're not as untouchable as you think you are. She turned on her heel and walked out of his office, leaving Richard standing there. His fists still clenched, his breath ragged. As the door clicked shut behind her, Jasmine felt a sense of relief wash over her. The confrontation had been intense, but she had survived it. And more importantly, she hadn't backed down. As the days passed, Jasmine continued to collect evidence, but something had shifted in the office. Richard's once confident demeanor had begun to crack. He was still as condescending as ever, but there was an edge of desperation to his actions now. The higher-ups were beginning to ask questions, and Richard's control over the company's operations was slipping. Jasmine had become more than just a disgruntled employee. She had become a symbol of resistance. Alicia continued to stand by her side, helping her gather additional evidence and providing support whenever the pressure became too much. There was a growing sense of unity among the employees who had witnessed Richard's behavior. Slowly but surely, the pieces were falling into place. Jasmine knew that the fight wasn't over, that it had only just begun. But she had the truth on her side, and the strength to see it through. And when Richard finally realized that his empire of fear and control was beginning to crumble, he knew his downfall was inevitable. Jasmine woke up the morning after her confrontation with Richard with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. The whole office seemed to hum with tension. She had barely slept, the adrenaline of standing up to Richard still surging through her veins. But that was the problem. Her resolve had been solid in the moment, but now the reality of what she'd done was beginning to settle in. She had made her move. There was no turning back. She dressed slowly, her movements deliberate, trying to calm the storm inside her. When she entered the office, the usual buzz of activity seemed quieter than usual. People were whispering, exchanging nervous glances as she passed by. Her coworkers were too afraid to make eye contact, and Jasmine could feel their discomfort. She didn't want to be the center of attention, but she knew she was. She could feel Richard's eyes on her the moment she stepped into the building. It wasn't subtle. The tension between them was palpable. Jasmine kept her head high as she walked to her desk. She had expected Richard to retaliate. His pride had been wounded, and he wasn't one to take such challenges lying down. But as the morning went on, it became clear that the retaliation was already underway. Her inbox was flooded with new tasks, the kind that weren't part of her job description. tedious, demeaning tasks meant to drain her energy and keep her from focusing on anything important. She could feel Richard's presence hanging over her, as if he were watching from behind the corner, waiting for her to crack. By noon, it was clear that things were escalating. Her workload doubled, and she found herself in endless meetings where she wasn't allowed to speak. Every time she tried to contribute, someone else would interrupt her or dismiss her ideas with a casual, "We'll get back to you on that." The message was clear. She wasn't welcome in the conversations that mattered. Jasmine tried to stay focused to keep her emotions in check. She had been here before. The constant undermining, the cold shoulder, the feeling of being invisible. But this time was different. This time she had a voice. The first real blow came in the form of an email, sent from HR. It was a notice about her performance review. She clicked the email, her stomach sinking as she read the words. They were giving her a final warning about her attitude, her productivity, and her supposed lack of collaboration with the team. It was nothing more than a veiled threat, a tactic meant to undermine her confidence, to get her to doubt herself and back off. Jasmine read the email again, her hands trembling. This wasn't just about her work. It was retaliation for speaking up. They were trying to break her, to force her to comply, to silence her. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. But she couldn't let it control her. She couldn't let them see how much it hurt. "Hey, Jasmine," Matt said from across the room, interrupting her thoughts. He looked uncomfortable, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was around. "You okay?" Jasmine forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just a little busy. It's been a hectic day." Matt didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press her further. Instead, he leaned in a little closer, his voice low. "I heard about your performance review. It's bullshit. Everyone knows it's retaliation. I've got your back, and so do a few others. But be careful. This is the kind of thing that could escalate quickly." Jasmine nodded, her throat tight. She knew that her allies in the office were few, but Matt had always been a steady presence. "Thanks," she whispered, grateful for his support. "I'll be okay." But even as she said it, Jasmine knew the fight was taking its toll. Every moment felt like a battle, and she was starting to lose track of which ones were worth fighting. Richard wasn't just playing games anymore. He was using the company's systems against her, playing with the rules to make sure she couldn't win. Later that afternoon, Alicia showed up at her desk, her face serious. She sat down without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the office nervously before focusing back on Jasmine. "Jasmine, we need to talk," Alicia said, her voice tense. "I just got word from someone in the legal department. Richard has already started to make moves against you. He's trying to paint you as the instigator in all of this. He's pushing for you to be dismissed, and he's talking to HR about insubordination." Jasmine felt a cold rush of panic, but she kept her voice steady. "What does that mean for me?" "It means he's already working the system, trying to make sure you lose this fight," Alicia said grimly. "They're building a case against you. They're trying to discredit everything you've said about him, make it seem like you're the one causing problems in the office." Jasmine's mind raced. She had expected retaliation, but not this direct, not so quickly. How can they do that? I've done everything by the book. I've reported him to HR. I have proof. Alicia shook her head. That doesn't matter when they're all in on it. The system is set up to protect people like him, Jasmine. And you know it. If we don't act fast, you might find yourself on the wrong side of an official investigation. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. What can we do? I can't let him get away with this. Alicia paused, her gaze softening. We need more allies. We need people who are willing to speak up, to go on the record, to testify. I know it's a lot to ask, but I think we can turn this around if we can get a few more people to back us up. Jasmine nodded, her determination flooding back. She had fought too hard to let Richard win now. I'll do whatever it takes. We can't let him get away with this. That evening, Jasmine reached out to the former employees she had been in contact with, asking them to stand with her. Some agreed to help immediately, others hesitated, but slowly, she began to build a coalition of people willing to speak out. She had always known that she couldn't fight this alone, but now, as she gathered her support, she felt a renewed sense of power. This fight was no longer just about her. It was about the countless others who had been silenced by the system, the people who had been crushed by the weight of Richard's manipulation. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Jasmine knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. Richard might have the system on his side, but she had the truth. And that was a weapon more powerful than anything he could throw at her. Jasmine could feel it now, the shift in the air. It wasn't just the mounting pressure from Richard or the increasingly tense atmosphere at work. It was the realization that things were beginning to unravel. What had once seemed like a fight she was destined to lose was now slowly tilting in her favor. The more she dug, the more she uncovered, and the more people rallied around her. But that didn't make it easier. Every step felt like walking on a tightrope, and one misstep could send everything crashing down. She couldn't afford to lose her footing now. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. Richard's attempts to undermine her grew bolder. He had escalated his tactics, sending her emails with demeaning comments about her performance, assigning her tasks with impossible deadlines, and isolating her from key meetings. It was clear that he was trying to break her, to make her look like the problem. But Jasmine refused to bend. She spent hours each night compiling evidence, organizing her notes, and preparing herself for whatever came next. Alicia, as always, was by her side, offering both emotional support and practical help. But they knew they couldn't do this alone. They needed more. They needed to expose the systemic issues, the pattern of abuse, and the culture of silence that had allowed Richard to thrive for so long. As Jasmine met with more former employees, some who had left quietly and others who had been forced out, her case grew stronger. Each person had a story to tell. And with each new story, the image of Richard as a man of power, the untouchable boss, began to crack. But Richard wasn't going down without a fight. He had started to rally his own allies within the company, pulling strings with senior management, twisting the narrative in his favor. The higher-ups, always more concerned with maintaining the company's image than with the truth, seemed more and more willing to protect him. They brushed aside the complaints, dismissed the evidence, and sided with Richard every time. Jasmine's frustration boiled over one morning when, after a long meeting with HR, she was told once again that her complaints were being reviewed, but that no immediate action would be taken. It was becoming clear that the company was doing everything in its power to avoid making a decision. They were waiting for her to give up, to lose hope, to walk away. But Jasmine wasn't about to do that. She had been pushed to the brink, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Later that evening, after another draining day at the office, Alicia called her. The urgency in her voice was enough to make Jasmine sit up straight. "Jasmine, you need to see this," Alicia said, her words coming fast, full of tension. "I've been talking to some of the higher-ups, and they're scrambling. Richard's been lying about everything, trying to say that you're the one who's been making trouble. But it's worse than that. The company's starting to cover things up. They're trying to erase the evidence." Jasmine's stomach dropped. She had suspected that the company would protect Richard, but this was beyond what she had imagined. "What do you mean? Are they deleting emails? Destroying files?" "Not just that," Alicia replied, her voice low. "I've heard that some of the senior leadership has been meeting in private. They're trying to make sure there's no record of the complaints, no evidence that can link Richard to any wrongdoing. They're covering their tracks, Jasmine. This is getting real ugly." Jasmine felt a rush of panic, but she quickly squashed it down. She had to stay focused. "We can't let them get away with this. We need to get the evidence out there before they cover it up completely." Alicia hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I've been thinking, if we can get enough people to speak up, if we have enough witnesses, we can go public. We can take this outside the company." The idea hit Jasmine like a jolt of electricity. Going public would be risky, dangerous even, but it was the only way they could force the company to take action. And if they didn't act soon, they might lose everything. "We can't wait any longer," Jasmine said, her voice shaking with determination. "Let's do it. Let's take it to the media. We need to expose them for what they're doing. Richard can't hide behind the company's power anymore." Alicia agreed, her tone resolute. "I'll start gathering the rest of the testimonies. We'll make sure we have everything we need." The next week was a whirlwind. Jasmine and Alicia worked tirelessly to compile the evidence, reaching out to former employees, pulling together legal advice, and drafting a formal statement. As much as they feared the consequences, they both knew that this was the only way to make things right. Richard's lies and the company's inaction would no longer go unchecked. On the day they sent the package to the media, the weight of what they were about to do settled heavily on Jasmine's shoulders. The consequences were unknown. This could cost her everything: her job, her reputation, her peace of mind. But the stakes were too high, and for the first time in months, Jasmine felt like she was in control. She wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been made to feel small. That afternoon, as Jasmine was sitting at her desk, Richard walked past her cubicle. His gaze was as cold as ever, but this time something in his eyes flickered, something close to fear. He didn't say anything, but for a brief moment, Jasmine saw him for what he truly was: a man who knew his time was running out. The next few days were a blur. The company tried to contain the story, but once the media got involved, it was too late. Journalists started to ask tough questions, former employees came forward, and the public backlash was swift. Richard's power began to slip away, and the company could no longer protect him. The investigation into his actions intensified, and the pressure on the senior management to take action became undeniable. But it wasn't just Richard who was feeling the heat, it was the company itself. As the stories unfolded, the truth about the culture of silence and complicity within the organization began to emerge. It wasn't just one man's actions that had to be held accountable, it was the system that had allowed him to thrive unchecked. Jasmine's victory wasn't just about exposing Richard, it was about exposing the deeper issues that had plagued the company for years. It was about standing up to a system that had been rigged against people like her and forcing it to change. As the dust began to settle, Jasmine took a deep breath. She knew there was still a long road ahead of her, but she had won. The power had shifted. Richard had been exposed, and the company was finally forced to confront its complicity in his actions. And Jasmine, she had found her voice, and nothing could take that away from her. Jasmine sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The weight of everything that had happened, the months of fear, the uncertainty, the battles with Richard, and the company's complicity in his actions, was finally starting to lift. The last few weeks had been a blur of media interviews, meetings with lawyers, and conversations with former employees who had come forward to speak about their own experiences. And now the company was in damage control mode. Public relations teams were scrambling to handle the fallout from the scandal, while the executives, who had once ignored Jasmine's complaints, were finally taking action. Richard had been suspended indefinitely, and an external investigation into his actions had begun. He was no longer the untouchable boss. His fall from grace had been swift and undeniable. But Jasmine wasn't celebrating. It was hard to feel victorious when the toll of the battle was still so raw. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was an email from Alicia. "Alicia, Jasmine just wanted to check in and make sure you're holding up. The company's offering a settlement, but I know we've talked about what you really want. We both know this isn't just about the money. Keep your head up, I'm proud of you." Jasmine smiled faintly at the message, grateful for Alicia's constant support. The settlement offer was the company's way of trying to put this whole thing behind them, a financial offer meant to keep her from pursuing further action. But Jasmine knew it wasn't about the money for her. It never had been. It was about justice. She had already made up her mind. She wasn't taking the settlement. The company wanted to close the chapter and move on, but Jasmine was determined to see this through to the end. She needed more than just a financial payout. She needed accountability, a system that would no longer allow people like Richard to thrive at the expense of others. She wanted a world where her fight wouldn't be for nothing, where people like her wouldn't have to endure this kind of abuse again. As Jasmine mulled over her decision, a soft knock on her office door pulled her out of her thoughts. She looked up to see Mrs. Thomas, the HR representative, standing in the doorway. Her expression a mixture of discomfort and formal politeness. "Jasmine," Mrs. Thomas said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I know things have been difficult, but I wanted to come and speak with you in person about what's been happening." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. She hadn't expected the HR department to reach out directly after everything that had transpired. "I'm listening." Mrs. Thomas hesitated before sitting down in the chair across from Jasmine's desk. "First, I want to apologize," she began, her voice tight. "I know the company failed you. I know we didn't act quickly enough. We should have done more when you first came to us. I can't speak for the entire leadership team, but I want you to know that I regret the way things were handled." Jasmine nodded, her arms crossed. She wasn't interested in apologies. At least not anymore. But Mrs. Thomas's words, while lacking in genuine warmth, at least showed a recognition of the company's failures. That was something. "I've been informed that you've chosen not to accept the settlement," Mrs. Thomas continued. "I respect that, but I need to make sure you understand the full implications of that decision. It's not just about the money. It's about how this will be handled from here on out. It's about your reputation, your career. There are risks involved with going public and refusing the settlement." Jasmine could feel the weight of the woman's words, but she wasn't swayed. "I understand," she said firmly. "But my decision stands. This isn't about my career. This is about making sure Richard pays for what he's done. It's about holding the company accountable." Mrs. Thomas didn't speak for a moment. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. "I want to be clear, Jasmine. The company is going to make changes. Richard is facing consequences, and there are going to be policy changes across the board to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. But we can't undo the past." Jasmine's chest tightened. The past couldn't be undone, no. But it didn't mean it had to continue. "I want real change," she said quietly, her voice full of resolve. "I want a company culture where people are heard, where they're respected, where this kind of behavior isn't tolerated." Mrs. Thomas met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, Jasmine saw something like genuine acknowledgement in her eyes. "We'll work on that," she said, her voice quieter now. "I can't promise immediate results, but I'll do everything I can to make sure this is a turning point." Jasmine nodded. "Thank you." Weeks passed, and the external investigation continued. Richard's role in the company was officially terminated, and the media coverage of his actions ensured that his reputation, once so polished and untouchable, was now permanently tarnished. The company announced new diversity and inclusion initiatives, promised reforms in HR processes, and began implementing leadership training designed to address issues of systemic racism and abuse of power. But Jasmine wasn't content to simply watch from the sidelines. She was part of the process now. She wasn't going to let the company get away with making empty promises. With Alicia's support, she organized meetings with other employees who had come forward, pushing for transparency and accountability in the changes the company promised to make. She worked tirelessly, sometimes late into the night, writing proposals, attending meetings, and advocating for policies that would protect future employees from the same treatment she had endured. She knew the work wasn't over. It would never truly be over. The scars of this experience would stay with her for a long time. But Jasmine felt different now. She felt empowered. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to stop speaking up, no matter how difficult it got. One afternoon, as Jasmine was finishing up a report, she received a call. It was from one of the former employees who had helped her with the case, someone she hadn't spoken to in a while. "Jasmine, I just wanted to say thank you," the voice on the other end said. "What you did. It wasn't just for you. It was for all of us. You made sure we were finally heard." Jasmine's throat tightened as she listened, and she felt a surge of emotion she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a collective effort, a movement. They had all stood together, united in the face of a system that tried to silence them. "Thank you," Jasmine whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without all of you." As she hung up the phone, Jasmine looked out the window, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. She had fought for justice, and though the scars remained, she knew she had made a difference. And that was enough.